apologize for the rain, because rain is good. And we've been very blessed all week, I think, with excellent weather, and now we're having a great session of rain. But I hope you've had a good evening. Certainly last night was amazing. I think Bill has all demonstrated to us that he has misspent his youth in certain places, and he has another career, definitely, if he wishes to go into show business, I believe. And compliments to all of you, the great dancers. We do begin on a sad note, and that was we apologize because of the internet problems yesterday. And it was persistent, particularly sorry and apologetic to those who were training and were interrupted in their course. So apologies on that point, but let's get right into the day and hope that this is as productive for you as it has been for the past 3 days. To begin, just a quick encapsulation of the highlights yesterday. We had 2 panels, as you know, Partnerships for Data Revolution in Agriculture. David Bergmanson was the moderator with very distinguished people. And Smart Infrastructure in Communities, Urban, Peri-Urban, Rural, with Professor Reg Vachon as the moderator. Highlights: agriculture is the greatest employer in Kenya and in Africa generally, and notwithstanding other areas of the world and countries. ICT play critical roles in the new generation of public-private partnerships that are evolving very quickly. Governments, business, civil society, and universities to support small holdings farmers, reduce investment risk, and increase capacity for local decision-making. Sources for finance, land management, extension services, civil society, supporting training for digital literacy, and translation into local languages were the highlights that the panelists brought to our attention. This is the content that we talk about. And in Kenya, as a highlight, there is an e-extension program in agriculture underway in collaboration with meteorological assets, seed, and fertilizer sources. In Smart Infrastructure in Communities, this panel focused on a very important defining theme, and that is engineers have a significant and seminal role in development, building infrastructure, designing, building, operating, maintaining infrastructure as they do. And this was a panel that showed the symbiosis of technologies and stakeholders, urban, peri-urban, and rural, in short, a continuum of society, featuring Sustainable Development Goal number 11, but certainly demonstrating that engineering and smart infrastructure is pervasive across all the SDGs. Mapping technologies have been particularly sophisticated for this purpose and sustainable development, and being used by many communities, bringing assets to scale and looking for common templates and best practices that can be shared. And as was said, GIS is not as complex. Geographic information systems as an asset are not as complex as they were in the past due to the movement of enterprise capability to the cloud. Very important point. Open data enables community of practice in cities and beyond by providing a consistent baseline. Mobile-enabled projects dominate, and sensors and the Internet of Things represent the next frontier, because development of the Internet of Things faces a range of technical and policy challenges, including particularly standards and interoperability, security and privacy, and spectrum bandwidth. Finally, Laura Woodman, NetHope CEO, finished the morning and said, we need to overcome our collection of data for data's sake. And we've been spoiled by technology and the declining costs rapidly of storage. So this is an addiction we have to really attend to, when resources are limited, of course. And she said, in short, you need to develop a new obsession as a community, where actionable information relevant to the context in which we work is the premium point. In short, taking massive data and turning it into actionable information. With 4 points particularly she emphasized. Empowered decision-making. What happened to our data, and is it accessible, is a good question, because many times your hard efforts are turned into a higher authority and you don't know its ultimate destination. Informed decisions based on better organizational culture, and visualization is a very powerful tool here for discerning information and decision-making. In short, pictures worth 1,000, maybe 10,000 words. Third, give and take when working in collaboration to improve the underlying data sets. Are we willing as organizations and as a community, in short, to engage in this way and share? And fourth, we must understand the context in which the data is needed. So thank you to all the participants and contributors yesterday. Our first speaker this morning, Paul O'Brien, who has a Juris Doctorate, among other things, from Harvard University, is current Vice President for Policy and Campaigns, Oxfam, America. He is extensively published as an expert on technology and activism, on humanitarian policy, human rights, and emerging trends in development. His presentation today is Technology and Activism, New Crises and New Opportunities. Previously, Paul was president of the Echoing Green Foundation and a litigator in New York City for Cravath, Swain, and Moore. And before joining Oxfam in 2007, he lived in Afghanistan for 5 years, where he worked in the Office of the President and the Ministry of Finance as an advisor on aid coordination, development planning, and policy reform, among other things. So I give you, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Paul O'Brien.
How many people went to 15 different presentations over the last 3 days, at least? How many went to 20? A lot of you. I went to more than 200 in the last couple of days, and I'm going to go to all the rest. And I happen to know, in a data-proven way, what is the most common opening slide of every presentation here. What's the one that you're most likely to see? Let's see if I can get this to go. Ta-da! How many of you have seen this? When I started out thinking about the SDGs with a bunch of other Oxfammers and other people who are thinking and talking about this, we saw this graphic, and many of us had a big problem. We had been campaigning in a broadcast way for years. We had seen it as our job at the central level to define a message, make it simple, make it clear, and get it to as many people as possible. And we had been delighted that the MDGs fit on a fridge magnet. And now we had an agenda when you stuck in the 169 targets that didn't even fit on a fridge. And we asked ourselves, how do we broadcast this to the world? How do we make that message simple? And at the beginning, we resisted deeply the SDG agenda because it was just too complicated. But let's talk a little bit about power and the SDGs and who got to frame this conversation. What I came to realize, listening to a lot of people over time and watching the process of their development, is that there were 3 important sets of voices in the SDG world. There were the development NGOs, the activists who said, our job is to keep people focused on what was at the heart of the MDGs: healthcare, women, education, and perhaps most of all, ending extreme poverty as we know it. We tried to make sure for a period that that was the only thing that was there. There was another group who wouldn't yield any ground in the conversation. Mainly this was represented, not exclusively, but by developing country governments. In fact, Macharia Kamau from Kenya was the co-chair of the process. And I watched him and many other developing country government leaders say, you know what? You are not going to reduce this SDG conversation to the old conversation. Because we want something more than the outcomes. We want the engine that's going to deliver those outcomes over a longer period. We want to talk about industrialization, energy, infrastructure, economic growth. That's how we're going to deliver on the SDGs ourselves. And a final group said, you know what, that's great. It's good that you're trying to end the MDGs, get them done. It's good that you want an enabling environment. But if you don't talk about the global public challenges that are going on in our world today, the fact that our planet is under so much stress, the fact that governance is so weak in so many contexts, the fact that we have growing inequality, you are not going to get any of that done. So these three sets of actors came to the table, and together they created this development agenda. And I would argue to you that we need to stop saying that these things are complicated and there's too many of them, because which of those constituencies is wrong? I'd argue to you that none of them are wrong. This is finally the most representative symbol of what development is really like in our world now. But how in goodness name do we deliver on them? Okay, if you want to talk about power in this world, it's not a bad idea to start thinking about money. It's not that all forms of power are about money. I heard some incredible conversations about different kinds of power here. But if you think that money and power are disconnected, I'd love to have a personal conversation with you afterwards, and let's do a transaction. This is the aid budget over the years from 1990 to 2012. And it's essentially, it started out at $100 billion, and it rose over that 12-year period to 150. To most people who have been looking at economic metrics in those times, it's essentially been flat. That little spike was the tsunami in 2006. Let me flatten that out. That's the same data right here. It's just on a different y-axis that starts looking not just in terms of billions, but in terms of trillions. Now let's look at private flows that went into developing countries. That's other official flows, that's foreign direct investment, portfolio equity, remittances, long-term debt, short-term debt. These are flows around which private sector actors may have engaged or which they were not grant funding that was given free. Now let's take all of that. Those are the private flows that went into developing countries. Flatten them out. Those are the domestic expenditures of developing country governments in that 12-year period. Almost $9 trillion. That was 2012. We're developing the next iteration of the chart. It's closer to 10 billion today. So if power is money, and if the SDGs are an incredibly ambitious but the right agenda that will help not only achieve the outcomes so many of us care about, but give us the engine room to do it while addressing global public challenges, then how in goodness name do we get the power that is represented by that money to be focused on the SDGs? And that's where activism comes in. Because once you start thinking about development as that challenge, then you ask yourself, what is going to be the theory of change that gets you from here to there? I don't know if you can see this. Formula on one side, formula on the other side, then a miracle occurs. Guy in the center says, I think you should be a bit more explicit here in step 2. When you start taking on bigger development challenges, as sometimes we like to think we do at Oxfam, you've got to start asking yourself, how do you cause? How does a set of interventions here that are much more complicated than direct service delivery lead to a set of outcomes there? And that leads you into, God help you, conversations about theories of change. And I think one of the things, if you're going to talk about power, we need to be very explicit about is that people bring very different kinds of personality and energy to theories of change. And I'm going to put to you that what I've heard in this conference and amongst many of us, and even within Oxfam, you see folks whose energy when it comes to theories of change, when it comes to activism and talking about power, it's fairly passive. There are others for whom it's passive-aggressive, and for others who it's plain straight-up aggressive. And it's good to name these things because you can actually have conversations with each other once you get beyond that. Let me put some examples to you. If you asked somebody, how in goodness name are we going to be able to translate all the money that's out there for development and get it focused on the SDGs and not on military planes or stuck in tax havens or invested in the wrong things and done much more effectively? And all they talk to you about over here on the right is it's just about innovation. We just need to create new and better ways of doing it. Or if they say it's just about getting more money, more investment, when it comes, they may be great development actors and they may be contributing well, but when it comes to activism and power, they take a fairly passive approach. They don't fundamentally want to engage in a conversation about politics. Over on the very left-hand side, purely coincidental that the aggressive stuff is on the left, you have conversations, when you start hearing people say, I want to talk about the institutions who could actually deliver this, and I want to talk about the incentives that will either make it disempowering for them or frightening for them not to work with me, or will get them to get on side, then you know you're starting to have a more political conversation. And I would argue, and I think this is important for us, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, that there's a whole bunch of us in Oxfam and in other places, particularly in the ICT4D world, who have a hell of a lot of confidence that information is what is going to transform this conversation, the right information in the right places. And we spend a lot of our time on transparency. But if the only thing we're willing to talk about is making data transparent, making it usable, and we're reluctant to talk about the politics of how it gets used, then I think we need to recognize that our theory of change is actually a fairly passive-aggressive one. We think somebody else is going to do the hard work of taking power away from institutions and individuals that have too much of it. Okay, if you're with me on that, I want to talk a little bit more about institutions. There's a triangle we often talk about, Oxfam. I want to tell you where the triangle came from. If you believe that institutions are important and you want to have a sophisticated conversation about how to change the amount of power they have, then it's worth naming them. One way we do it is to say all the institutions in the world, all of them, can be categorized into 4 boxes. They're either public or private in who they are, and they're either public or private in what they do. Okay? Why is it worth doing this? Think about public actors, that's who they are, whose job it is to serve the public interest. State actors. From a rights perspective, these are the ones who are responsible for fulfilling the SDGs in the main. They are the ones who actually have a mandate and who we can hold to account. And ones who work for the public interest are willing to work with us. Our challenge is to make their willingness translate into the most effective programs possible. Engage with them however we can. But we are essentially helping them to do their job. On the other side, and this is at the risk of stating the obvious, but we've had some incredibly interesting conversations with private sector actors here, and they are fundamental to delivering on the SDGs. But it is really important to remind ourselves, if you're an activist, that a private actor who is working in the private interest, it is not their job, fundamentally, to wake up. They may have translated it into their business model, but if their shareholders ask them, what is your core reason for being? And they said, it's to deliver on SDG X. That would be a very difficult conversation. Now, what we've heard in this room is how so many businesses, particularly the enlightened ones, and there aren't enough of them, are realizing that to make profit, to deliver on the private interest, it is very smart of them to also think about their power as development actors. But as an activist, you need to start with where they come from. And finally, and importantly, in this sort of triangle, there's all of us. All of us. If you are a private actor Nobody voted for you. Nobody gave your institution a mandate. Nobody told you you have a right to do this work. But you work on the public interest, either whether you're the biggest foundation in the world or a community-based organization that's working with a small group of women in one place. You are a civil society actor who's chosen to address the public interest, but you don't have a mandate that comes from anywhere else to do so, except the legitimacy that you create through your work. From a power perspective, that's very important. Okay, finally, obviously, you have potentially the most problematic quadrant in this group. Those public actors whose job it is to deliver on the public interest, but who, in fact, pursue private interests. And that is fundamentally the definition of corruption. And perhaps one could argue from an activist perspective, that may be the most important quadrant in terms of determining whether the SDGs get delivered. If you believe most of the money will lie with public actors, and it's whether they desire to achieve the public interest of the SDGs or some other goal that matters. Okay, if you buy what I've just said up there, and you think there's an interesting conversation to be had, then the question is, how do you get the two most powerful sets of institutions to actually wake up every day and think about delivering on the SDGs, even if they're private institutions, it's not their fundamental job, or even if they're governments, they may not have even heard at the ministry level or the subnational level about the SDGs. They obviously, though, might care about the public interest embedded in there. I will put to you that our shared theory of change in this room and at this conference, the conversation we've been trying to build, is that if we can get better information into the right hands, if we as civil society organizations can be relevant to citizens in translating that data, if we can use ICT for accountability, there is a chance, just a chance, that we can have a powerful impact on both governments and corporations to accelerate the delivery of the SDGs. And that is the core challenge if you see yourself as an activist. Passive, passive-aggressive, or all-out crazy angry. Okay. If we're going to deliver on that theory of change, one of the things we need to be honest about and thoughtful about is what are the challenges that are going to prevent us from doing it. And let's remember that we have no natural relevance to this equation other than that which we can create through our work, through our relationships. Here's 3 provocations for you. If we're going to actually deliver in the next 15 years, I think we're going to have to talk honestly about rational ignorance, the fact of closing space, and this wonky word, I'm looking for a less wonky word, but disintermediation. I've heard really great stories about it that haven't had to use that wonky word over the last few days, so maybe somebody can come up with one. What do I mean by these 3 things? 1, rational ignorance. Rational ignorance, this may offend some, but I would argue that ignorance is rational when the costs of gaining knowledge outweigh the benefits. Today, we produce the same amount of data every 2 days, 2 years, 2 years, every 2 years, as was produced in the entire time from year 0 to 2003. And particularly those passive-aggressive activists who just said, all I want to do is make sure there's information and transparency out there, were so successful, and Oxfam, by the way, were part of that journey, that data production has been a much greater focus of our attention than data relevance. And in that kind of world, it becomes more and more rational for busy people to ignore it. My daughter goes to a public school in Washington, D.C., and I'm dissatisfied with some of the, it's a very expensive school district. The city spends more on education than a lot of the states around the United States have, and yet the outcomes aren't great. When was the last time I looked at the budget data for education or the indicators? Never. Okay, here's an interesting way to think about how to challenge rational ignorance. Two researchers, P.X. Soto is one and Johnny Fox is the other, did a paper that was published, Why ICT Matters for Accountability, in January of this year. It's a great read, but I want to throw this graphic at you because I think it may help us to have an interesting conversation about rational ignorance. If, when you're producing data and you're trying to engage active citizens, that central box on the theory of change, or civic organizations, and you go to a citizen with a piece of data, you're often trying to do one of two things. You're either trying to engage them as an individual and see what their power is as an individual on an issue that they personally care about, or you're trying to reach them as a civic actor, where you're asking them to care about something bigger than themselves. So Fox and Piaxetto took a look at 23 initiatives that have been using ICT for accountability, and they divided them up into those that just go after individuals and treat them as individuals, and they called it user feedback. That's over on the left, that blue circle. And they looked at initiatives that asked people to show up as civic actors, and they called that civic action. And then they asked which one of those, and they looked at 23 different projects that did that, which ones of those actually got citizens to pay attention? Or another way to put it, in which ones of those initiatives was engaging the data rational for citizens? And what they found out of the 23 initiatives was that only 7 actually got the two things we cared about most. 1, people engaged, and 2, government responded. People engaged, they called Yelp. Government response, they called teeth. Which ones had both Yelp and teeth? And here's what they found that I think is really interesting if you're trying to make sure that data and technology you're using actually overcomes rational ignorance. By far the most effective were the ones that did both. So Magi Voice here in Kenya was one of the ones that did really well on user feedback. It asked users to give a review of how well water services were being provided by the utility. But 75% of it was done in paper, so it was very hard to get it together. Only 3% of the Magi Water feedback forms were done online. But it did get government feedback because somebody went through the effort of attaching all the feedback to the right subnational part of the water utility service that was providing it so they could see it. And government said it was incredibly useful in improving the services. That was Magi Voice. Down here in the center, Lungisa, which was in Cape Town, did almost the same thing to make sure that people could provide feedback on essential services in Cape Town. But here's the difference. People could see other people's feedback, and they could comment with each other to see if something bigger was happening. So it was public, and it was open. So people put in their feedback personally, but they were able to see themselves as something larger, and it had huge impact in the city. And finally, over here on the right, in terms of civic action, there are moments where citizens are willing to sign up for something much bigger than themselves, where they have no personal interest. At least nothing that they can, of course they have a larger personal interest, but they trust that if they raise their voice along with so many others, something good will happen that is bigger than just an individual transaction. In Brazil, the government convinced people that it was really serious when it said participatory budgeting is going to determine how we spend our money. So people submitted online what they wanted the budget to be in districts, and that data was aggregated, and it really did make a difference. But it was the exception rather than the rule. The reason I think this is important is that so much of us the work that we do in activism that's trying to overcome rational ignorance, it doesn't ask the question, how can I link what's individually important to you, the daughter that you have that you want vaccinated, the child you want educated, that concern that you have, to a bigger political issue. And we, with technology at our disposal, have the ability to make that link much faster than so many others. Okay, civil society space, we all know the problems about it. We've been talking a lot about it over the last couple of days. It's getting worse and worse. 96 countries last year saw something happen which closed space. The one thing I wanted to challenge you on is talk about it as one thing that is the same in all contexts. It's not. Imagine you could map the countries of the world from those that are really developmental. They really care at the national state level about achieving economic rights like healthcare and education and investing their monies there. And imagine countries at the far end that are fundamentally corrupt. And what elites care about in that environment is making sure that whatever resources come out of the economy are captured by them. Now imagine a spectrum that goes up and down where you have the chance to have full political and open debate in some contexts that are open, and others at the other end of the spectrum that are authoritarian and won't allow any space at all. So just to walk you through that, strong civic life and developmental governments. Here you may have strong institutions and corrupt governments. I asked a friend the other day, a Kenyan friend, where he would put Kenya on this map, and he said somewhere closer to that top left side. We have great NGOs, great think tanks, we have some great government officials, but corruption is still one of the biggest challenges we face here. You know, we can debate this conversation, but here's the point I want to make. If you are concerned about closing civic space as an activist, if you're concerned about redistributing power, you're going to have to think differently about it in different contexts. So, what we've seen in open contexts, where the state is or claims to be developmental, in the UK in the last couple of years, we've seen closing civic space. We had a great conversation last night about what's happening in the United States when it comes to privacy. And here's what's really interesting. The largest tech corporations in the US recognize that something is happening to privacy, and although they are deeply competitive with each other, they are Google, Apple, Facebook, working together to make sure that the space that is closing doesn't happen without their collective voice. We've seen space closing in places like Canada, and as I said, Britain. I would argue that the way civic actors should engage in that context is we must work together. And I'm not sure that we always do. In places where it's more corrupt, but they do have a robust civic life, media, think tanks, open conversation, great local organizations who can drive conversations into public space. Perhaps the way to address space is maybe not to target the individuals who are at the heart of it, the principals who want to close that space, but to focus on the principles that keep the space open. And that's what we've tried to do in places like Ghana, Nigeria, and if my friend is correct, something we may want to be talking about here in Kenya, where there have been significant challenges to how much political dialogue NGOs can engage in the last couple of years. Okay. Third, in places where they no longer have a developmental agenda, nor do they have political space, and civic actors, local civic actors are trying to engage in activism, this is a place where I think international NGOs can play a powerfully useful added value function, where we can help raise our voices because we're not in the country, or because we can leave if we have to and still exert power, that we can help create space alongside our local partners for civic life and to hold powerful institutions accountable. And finally, in places where they really do care about development and where they really do want to see the SDGs fulfilled, but they don't want their media or their civil society organizations publicly embarrassing them, it may be a space in which the way to fight for civic space is through insider advocacy. It's a provocation. Let's talk about it. Okay, last comment, and I just want to share a couple of stories here. One of the things that happens when you come to conferences like this that, you know, are mapping change over time. I haven't been before, but I came this year because the buzz that comes back to Oxfam after all of the conferences over past years is so powerful. And I've heard the stories about what folks have talked about. My sense is that one of the things we are talking about this year in different ways, and I'm seeing it coming up, is the very question of our relevance to everything that we're trying to do. Why do you need to have international and local civil society working together to deliver on the SDGs if the fundamental question is how we get powerful institutions other than us to deliver the SDGs? I listened to Al Cams on Monday talk about, in fact, he named Oxfam, which was a little bit sad. He said, you know, let me tell you what happens when a donor gives $1 million to build a borehole in this country. And imagine that it's Oxfam. Well, first, Oxfam has to have a planning conversation at the headquarters level, and then it has to come in and do the surveying. And he listed all these changes. And by the time he'd finished with his 10 stages of what it takes, you can imagine how much money was left to actually build the borehole. And so his question to us is, if you're going to take that $1 million, tell me why it is worth it to spend it through you as an international actor rather than a local institution who's ready to build that borehole right on the ground. He's asking a question about disintermediation. Why do you still need to be in the picture? I heard John from Cisco, I don't know if he's here. Private sector folks, they probably wake up late. But I heard him yesterday, say, you know what? I've been listening to you guys and you talk all about power, that it's all about power. And you keep saying that money is power. So why do all of you nonprofit folks think that any of you, international or local, should be taking that money? If money is power, and what we're really here to do is distribute power from the haves to the have-nots, then why don't you just give them the money? Why don't you just make sure that the cash goes directly to them? They will tell you what they need. If you've got a great ICT program, let them tell you that it's great by using their money to work with you on it. You're telling them, you know what? Instead of you getting $100 to make sure your child gets vaccinated, I'm going to take 80 of those dollars and do an initiative to make sure she doesn't just get vaccinated today, but she gets vaccinated over the next 10 years, because I'm going to change the power of those institutions that can deliver that and their willingness to do so. John said, let her decide if you're worth the $80. So here's my last provocation, just because I want to give testament to it, and I have a lovely chance to spend a little more time on the stage later on, but not talking, asking questions of Chisenya and others. But I met Chisenya yesterday. Is she here? And I listened to her and Judith talk about working with girls who haven't traditionally felt they had so much power in the world, and how by giving them a sense of technology and its power, they could give them a completely different set of opportunities in life. It was amazing. And we also talked about Go Girls in South Sudan. But when they talked about power, these activists, they said, you know what? Power is infinite. You can take someone who feels that they have none, and by giving them the chance to work with technology, to find focus, to build a skill, you can create a sense of empowerment that will change the world. And nobody needs to be worse off. What I've argued at Oxfam, my final provocation, is that when you really think about power in the hardest ways, it's about redistributing it. if we are really going to make sure that the people we care about have more power to lift themselves out of the struggles that they're facing, then we are going to need to be honest about where that power comes from. Somebody who sits somewhere is going to have less power to dictate how we should live. It needs to be redistributed. That's a conversation, if you want to be thinking about activism, that is worth having. Is it better to think about power as something that's infinite, or is it better to think about it as something that needs to come from somewhere if it's really going to go to the people we care about? I hope we do engage that conversation over the remaining time. And I hope you take some time over the course of the day, particularly for Carol, to tweet all the things that we're going to talk about today and keep this conversation going. Thanks for the opportunity to chat with you.
I guess everybody is awake and we can really discuss whether impact investing is boon or bane. I'm really delighted to have a great panel here, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But we have perspectives from the government, academia, the investing organizations, as well as from the INGO sector. So, and myself as an entrepreneur being on the other side. So we've all heard about impact investing, and let's just kind of kick it off, and then our panelists will talk, and then we'll put it open for questions. Okay, now, yes. So people actually came up to me last few days and said, when you talk about the impact investing panel, could you at least tell us what is impact investing? Because there's so many ideas about it. So there is an intention for impact investing that's very clear. That is to generate social and environmental impact alongside the financial impact, a financial return. So that's very clearly articulated, whether you're a B Corp, whether you're a social enterprise, whether you're a nonprofit. So you make sure that you generate the social and environmental impact. And they can be made both in emerging and developed or mature markets, as they are referred to now. I love that term, emerging markets and mature markets. So it could be in the Bronx in New York City, it could be with refugees in the developed world, and it could be in all of our emerging markets as well. And it's to get a range of returns from below market, which could be an investment in a nonprofit that is scaling, but there's no return except that there is an earned income model, and it could be all the way up to market rate. So that is sort of the general description of impact investing, and we'll talk about some of the details about how these things happen. Because it could go from grants to debt to demand dividends to equity investing. So there is a wide range of things. But the most important thing is, how do you put good money to use to be able to get social and environmental impact while your money is being also utilized from a financial point of view? Okay, so you'll hear these terms: innovation, entrepreneurship, and investing. They're not new terms. That's what the venture capitalists and the whole investment world, that's what we live in Silicon Valley. Innovation, entrepreneurship, and investing. But don't think that that is just for the corporate world and for companies that go public, because we have exactly the right things for our world. Frugal innovation, it's just a little different, social entrepreneurship, and impact investing. Frugal innovation is about innovation for the problems that we face for societal and environmental issues all over the world. Social entrepreneurship, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is about entrepreneurship around social impact, and of course, impact investing. Okay, so I often get asked by my students, what is social entrepreneurship? How can those two come together? Even investors ask that. For social, profit is a four-letter word. For entrepreneurship, in the traditional way, it's profit, profit, profit. How can these two come together? Is there ambiguity? Is there a dichotomy here? And developing markets need a new approach to business, and that's social entrepreneurship. So if you do that, then out of this comes new products, that's the innovation, new distribution systems, new business models. So a lot of people think innovation and it's around just the technology, products, and so if you have the technology, the product, or the solution, it should work. That's just one part of it. The new distribution systems, how do you get it to the last mile? And the new business models around it, which is the impact investing and the different kinds of funds that are available, and the business models around that form a very important part of the innovation for emerging markets. So you will here see this traditional venture capital, which is looking primarily at the financial rate of return, patient capital, and traditional philanthropy. So you have the traditional venture capital and the traditional philanthropy. One looks just at impact, one looks just at profit and the financial return. And patient capital is what we are going to talk about. In fact, there are people like Pierre Omidyar who would argue that eBay was one of the best examples. I mean, it's a very profitable business, but that it had has social impact. So, golly. Okay. This is a little busy slide, this one and the next one, but it kind of puts the continuum of impact investment, starting with the where do you have what kinds of capital? That's the purpose of the slide. It was put together, it's called Priming the Pump, and it's put together by a number of impact investors led by the Omidyar Network. And we actually use it as almost like a primer in the impact investing world. So you start with market infrastructure. So if you're looking at how do you take rice husk, and gasify it to convert it into power and being able to power villages, a village a week, then you need to start with a basic infrastructure that might require a grant-based money to even prove that the model works, because a for-profit model would be hard to do that investment in. So something like that, or skilling of people who have no money to actually pay for the skilling, coming from rural areas, that might be in the non-revenue generating or in the non-profit sense. However, even those organizations over time have to become a higher revenue generating, even as a nonprofit, because they need an earned income to be able to sustain themselves and to scale. So you bring that a little bit more to the right. Then you start to get to this edge of going between nonprofit and for-profit. And they are usually the market innovators, the ones that start to define models, define new business models, whether it's Solar Sister, or define new business models and being able to do impact sourcing, like a digital divide data. We ourselves do that from iMerit. So you start with below market returns because you're proving the model that a young person anywhere can be skilled to deliver digital economy services. Well, you have to first prove the model. So you start with, it's still an equity investment, but you start with below market returns. Then as that scales, as it gets more and more to the right, you then get market returns recognized by select investors, usually the core of impact investing, where they're looking for financial return and at the same time, a real important mission alignment of social impact. And then you get more to the right as it really scales, and this is where the jury's still out, whether can you scale this into a billion-dollar corporation, can you scale this into, I don't know about Facebook, but whatever kind of company, and so can impact investing become mainstream investing, and that's the discussion we'll have today, and thereby create market scalers and market sectors, a whole sector around, could be in some form of impact investing around energy or agriculture or mobile apps or health or digital services. So this is the whole invest. I actually will not go into the details of this, but I'll make it available. But it really looks at the donor investor, the screening, the expected financial return, the expected impact intent, and what the donors and investors are seeking. So this is the detail of how, whether you're donating, impact investing, or you're being a venture capital investor, what are the different stages? And each of us needs to figure out where we fall in this continuum and be very careful about the kind of investor that you go after. And that, from a social entrepreneur, as an entrepreneur, I would say one of the most important decisions we make as leaders or even running a social enterprise is, who, as an impact investor, do we select? So don't think it's just them selecting us, it's also us selecting the impact investor. And that depends upon this. So I will just end with, it's about $60 billion, but it's 11 trillion in total investments. But just in the last year, about, actually it's $14 billion. This is only up to October, $14 billion of new committed impact investments last year. And yes, these are some of the players. We are very fortunate at iMerit to deal with Omidyar Network, who was our seed investor and then did the A round, Dell Ventures or Dell Foundation, and Khosla Impact. Khosla is an example where they have Khosla Ventures, VC, and Khosla Impact on the impact side, and Acumen, etc. At the end of it, the impact is about people, change, and returns. So yesterday when we had the discussion, we talked about financial return and social impact. And so somebody brought up the fact that it's about the change and the transformation, and it's all about the people.
At least. So my name is Mary Mwangi. I work with the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs as the East Africa Chapter Manager. So the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs is a network of organizations that support small and growing businesses within emerging markets. So we are a network, we are a membership organization, and we are a community of practice. All our members are providing critical educational, financial, and business support services to small and growing businesses because we believe that by supporting these businesses, it's the best way to, first of all, produce long-term sustainable economic development, and at the same time produce social and environmental benefits to the communities in which they are working. Thank you. So I talked about small and growing businesses. So ideally, this is a business, the way we define it, that employs anything from 5 to 250 employees and has a growth capital requirement of anything from $20,000 to $2 million. So typically, all our members are investing in these types of businesses. So if you think about it on a continuum, we have the micro enterprises that are more livelihood sustaining types of businesses at one end of the spectrum, and medium-sized to corporate-sized businesses at the other end of the spectrum. So most of our members are working with businesses that are in the middle. Some literature has referred to it as the missing middle. So that's basically where we are working. And ideally, businesses in these types of businesses require not just capital, but they also require a lot of capacity development. So almost every investor is looking at a blended approach to working with these businesses. So Andy members fall within different categories. So a good chunk of our members are investors. A good number of them are impact investors. But we also have capacity development providers. We have quite a number of INGOs that are members of Andy, CRS being one of them. We do have research and advisory service firms, DFIs, and some corporations, specifically the ones that are working with small and growing businesses within their value chains. And of course, a few foundations as well. So what does Andy do? Andy's value proposition is around being able to convene all these different organizations that are supporting small and growing businesses in some shape or form that should be talking to one another but typically aren't. And we provide them that neutral platform to convene and facilitate collaboration between them. So we do a lot of knowledge sharing. We have learning labs, which are ideally an avenue for them to come together around specific topics, like, for example, talent, or how to get more capital into these businesses, or capacity development, or agriculture, sustainable agriculture in particular, women's entrepreneurship, youth entrepreneurship. So we do have quite a few learning labs. We also have the regional chapters, which is how we convene our members around the geographies in which they're active. We also do a lot of work around metrics and evaluation. So for every impact investor, the question that they will always ask themselves and their portfolio companies is, how are we measuring the impact? So we know how to measure financial returns, so how do we measure social and environmental returns? So we do a lot of collaboration around that. Training, fundraising resources, so helping our members, or basically directing more resources into the sector, into the impact investing, into the small and growing business sector, and research as well. Should I go on, or? Okay, great. So what I was meant to come and talk to you about today was around impact investing in East Africa. So what are the trends we are seeing, what's happening in this sector? So, great. So we do have more than 20 development finance institutions that are investing, for example, in East Africa, that are making impact investments in this space. And this slide tells us a little bit about which sectors they favor. So we are finding a lot of the DFIs are investing quite a bit of money in energy and financial services. Those are the two, more or less, the two sectors that are receiving the most of the DFI dollars that we are seeing coming into the region. And the source of most of this research is from our members who've done some research. So I'll refer a lot to research that has been done by Open Capital Advisors, by IDEV International, and by another firm called Disrupt Africa. IDEV and Open Capital are members of ANDI. So in terms of non-DFIs, so the impact funds, the non-development financial institutions investment vehicles, we are seeing many of them are investing in agriculture. So you'll see there's a spike around agriculture, but financial services is still a sector that's receiving quite a bit of attention. Oh, there you go. Sorry. Okay. There we go. One of the biggest enablers for impact businesses in Africa in general is technology. So we are seeing a lot of money not going to tech businesses, so not purely technology businesses, but technology-enabled businesses. So businesses is enabling, technology is enabling scale in many of these impact businesses. So we see South Africa has, for example, this is research that was done by Disrupt Africa, looking at startups and how they've raised money in the last 1 year. So this is Africa Tech Startup Funding for 2015. South Africa, 45 South African startups, tech startups or tech-enabled startups are able to raise money. 30 in Nigeria, Kenya has 18, and we can see it going down that way. One of the trends that we're seeing is that one of the sectors that's receiving the most attention is solar. So for example, the two biggest raises, funding raises last year were by solar companies. So in Kenya, I think we had Mkopa Solar, which is a pay-as-you-go solar solution, raised about $31.4 million, and Off-Grid Solar in Tanzania raised about $20 million, if I'm not wrong, through a couple of rounds. So solar has definitely been able to raise quite a bit of money. And the reason why these businesses are particularly attractive is because of their use of technology to provide access to communities that would otherwise not have access to energy. So they provide both access and affordability through pay-as-you-go solutions. So fintech is another sector that has been receiving quite a bit of attention. So another thing that we're seeing, sorry, there you go. So another thing that we're seeing is, for example, the use of technology in agriculture. So for example, I'm sure you must have had this statistic at some point this week. Over 90% of Kenyan adults use M-Pesa. So M-Pesa is a payment solution, and it, for example, makes it really easy for communities that are out of the reach by the banking sector or would otherwise be unbanked, as they are referred to access goods and services and to be able to pay for those goods and services. So mobile technology is really enabling businesses in Africa. In Kenya, we also see an interesting trend, Kenya versus Nigeria, where most of the Nigerian tech startups that were able to raise impact funds were e-commerce businesses, so it's online shopping solutions. And in Kenya, it's not so much the shopping solutions, but it's more businesses that are providing, for example, aggregating either consumers or aggregating producers that are using technology that have been able to raise a lot of that money. And we're also seeing a lot of tech businesses that are providing access to information. So information, for example, to mothers. So we've seen a few e-health businesses raise money. So those types of businesses are also seeing quite a bit of success in this region. So ideally, those were my sources. These are some studies that I would really encourage all of you to look at if you're looking at impact investing and what the landscape looks like in East Africa, and especially the role of technology in impact investing or in impact businesses. These are three studies that I would really encourage you all to look at. Thank you.
I'm saying this because DFID invested very little money to create an app of sending money. This is M-Pesa. Those of you who are not here on Monday, Safaricom made so much money from that app, M-Pesa. I was happy to have been on the board, but we were supposed to go to jail after proving it because it was going to facilitate money laundering. I'm saying this because in order to facilitate, to be able to do such things, and some of the projects I'm going to say, there is a lot of risk-taking that must be done by the regulators. We must have soft regulators because there are so many cases here, because I still work with so many people in the IT sector, so many cases with you here that would change the world, but the donor community or the government have not quite opened up to those cases to make them work like M-Pesa. And so after we landed the cable, I met the president of Rockefeller Foundation, and she said, we want to see whether impact sourcing can work in Kenya. They had funded something in Laos, I think, and then they came, they created digital divide data here. It has since provided jobs to people who would not have gotten jobs, and it's working towards self-sustainability. I'm happy Rada was using the term that I think it's a new concept, donor investment. I think the donors must learn from this that the 50 years of giving African countries grants, and when the grants are done, the whole project dies, should actually a formal decision be made that let's look into social enterprises or sustainability models, because we have so many of the kind that we can prove such concepts. And more importantly, we need to invest money in new concepts, because people have new concepts that we don't pay attention to understand what is going on. Our previous president was a risk taker, and again we came here and I said, Mr. President, I want you to allow us to use our data, government data, to facilitate new applications, because God has been so great with Africa that we have so many problems that if we release the data, we would solve some of those problems. He said, any problem with it? Just about when the WikiLeaks had happened. And I said, there will be no problem, Your Excellency. And he said, go ahead. After we released it, 100 new applications were up and running within 2 months. The impact has been so great, and we hope that this would continue, that we can find some solution towards the release of medical data, for example, so that we begin to understand disease profiles in these parts of the world, and so many other things. I am standing here to say that indeed, investments like what Rockefeller did do change and do disrupt. Investments like what DFID did indeed move from just investments in the, just like what would have been a grant and they walk away, to super enterprises, like what we see with the Safaricom. It's happening here today. So among you today, there are some, I could actually mention so many things that are happening in this landscape, but let me give you one example. And I think, I don't know whether Erica is around. Erica from Ground Truth. Well, she did something called MAB Kibera, and some of you have seen MAB Kibera, and completely was able to show exactly where the poor people live and who are the poor people. And surprisingly, even government did not know precisely the data from Kibera. And the first time she made the presentation with the young people who did the mapping, we began to see that the schools within the poorest of the poor neighborhoods, government had only 4%. The rest were run by the private sector, the NGOs, and other agencies that work within such places. Nobody has gone to invest in that. But that is the greatest disruptor. I'm not a prophet, but because I've been working around big data, without identification of the poor people and knowing them by name, we will not be able to achieve the SDGs. We cannot achieve those SDGs. And out of understanding where these people live, if we invested, because within a short while, it will become an enterprise, because such data is important to the private sector and grow. But nobody, not the government, not the donor community, is putting resources into such new applications. There are several other applications, because I was given, and I can see Radha is winking at me. There are several other applications. If we had time, we can talk individually that would disrupt the future. But we are not able to invest in them because we don't understand them. Nobody can be able to predict the future, but we have a problem with economists because they have held us hostage for many years looking for business cases and trying to predict what God never gave them to predict. And how long should we be held this hostage? Could we reinvent the new world if we are looking at such analysis from people who don't know the future? I'll finish by a little preaching. I'm sorry to preach, that if you read, I think it's Exodus 16, you would find that God himself would have actually made it possible that we don't plant food, that you wake up in the morning, you find it on your table. But he said, let me give you the brain that you can convert land into food and you eat it. That's why Israelites, he gave them manna outside and said, you go out there and pick it. So donors should not be giving resources to Africans without telling them to work and be able to sustain what you are funding. I think that's why we're here about impact, sourcing, impact investment, that we have seen these models work. Let us put more emphasis. I can see my World Bank friends seated there. We need to create more of this. And if you don't know which one to invest, you can catch me outside here. I have like 20 of them which are ready for investments. Thank you.
question Q&A. So we have Sean Ferris, and everybody knows Sean Ferris, and he'll bring a very unique perspective with the INGOs, the international NGOs, and impact investing. I don't think we could have heard those two terms together even 3 years ago, and now we're talking about that as a way of moving forward. Sean, all yours.
Thanks very much, Radha, and great to be with you all today again this morning. I'm actually an avatar, you can probably tell this morning. I'm talking on behalf of Beth Collins, who leads our impact investment team. She unfortunately couldn't be here today, but this is what an avatar actually looks like. You know, you may have other thoughts, but reality is not what it always seems. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the CRS journey in impact investing. This is something that we've just really started on, and you know, we see this as a long-term prospect for us to be able to look at raising or looking at new types of capital, and also looking at this idea of how we can integrate this into a new way of doing development work, I think. So I'm very quickly going through the ideas in this process. Here is just a quick graphic to show, if you like, our sort of well-being process as we work with different types of people. And we make different investments with different types of packages with clients that are in different stages, you know, of economic development, if you like. The recover people, these are people that are really just emerging from severe shock or suffering from chronic poverty. And we do a lot of asset transfers to those types of people to get them out of difficult situations. And as Dr. Betts just said, at the build stage, we're really looking to intensify skills sets so that people can take full advantage of the assets around them and their opportunities. And we're hoping to get people into this grow stage where they're really looking at strong market integration to build their own enterprises. So that, you know, in a very simple way, that's our kind of process of supporting communities. And if you sort of expand that idea a little bit further, on the far left-hand side, you've got this area of emergency work. And as Paul's graphic showed, huge amounts of money go into emergency. It's a huge lift to get people from an emergency situation back to a recover situation. And then we're making different types of investment. But hopefully we get people into what we call prosper. And at that prosper stage, this is where people are actually using commercial funds to run their own businesses, their own enterprises. Now we apply this to agriculture, but this could be applied to very many of the types of ventures that we invest in. So if you just think about that in terms of financial sources, obviously emergency work is an area where it's difficult to put private funds, although that is starting to happen. But a lot of the money there is public funding, and I think it will remain public for quite some time. But as you start to get into the development world, what we're starting to see is that we begin with more grant funding for the people that are in the most vulnerable situation. But as we start to empower people, that's where we can start to slipstream in private funding so that we're co-investing. And I look at all of our work really as a bit of a co-investment in any case, you know, whether we're co-investing with the local governments, with the communities that we're working with, but also the private sector. We're trying to use our money, if you like, to leverage more different types of capital into the work that we're doing. As we get towards the more endowed clients that we work with, so these are farmers that are probably having slightly larger farms, but they're more engaged in markets. This is where we want to bring much more private money so that we can accelerate the work that they're doing. And what we don't want to do is to get to a situation where once we've made these investments and then the projects are downsized and withdrawn, that you get backslide. And that is the real fear of a lot of development work, is that things are going well until the grants start to end and then things start to slide back again. So this is where I think there's a huge opportunity to bring in impact investing as a sort of a process of sustainability, if you like, but you know, real sustainability based around economic business models, but also to provide a much more robust exit strategy for us. Now, I don't mean exit strategy in the sense of venture capital. I mean the idea that we're designing projects that we have a clear endpoint, but it's really a handshake into a different financial investment sector. And so if you follow that kind of model, it's a different way of thinking about how things are done. Really, you're co-investing from the very start. you're looking to see how other people can bring in their capital to play in different projects that you're doing with different communities. And if you start with the idea that you need to leverage as your exit strategy, it's a very different mindset in the design of the project than if you're just saying, we will spend the grant on time. So I'm hoping that with impact investment, we really start to redesign the way that we do this. And I think that a lot of the donor groups now are asking us to do a much slower start to projects so that we can set up the relationships with the private sector. We can see where the communities can invest in us. And that's all really important at the start so that as you go through the projects, there's a crossover in terms of who's the players. This is just a map. I won't go into this at all, but there are a lot of players in the impact investing business. We've been very lucky to work with people like the Andy Group and Mary's team who have brought together this alliance of international NGOs to come into this process really to learn about it and to see what the opportunities for us in terms of doing this are. Now, we're also working with the church on this. And our Holy Father has sort of looked at this work, and he is now given his blessing, if you like, to taking this on. Many of you will know that the Catholic Church and many other churches are major providers of hospitals and schools around the world, particularly in Africa, I would say. And that's always been based around a charitable model. And I think what we're trying to see now is, can we use markets in ways that can help to scale out those different social services and really start to bring them much more into the social enterprise world. And so Pope Francis is supporting this process, and we're working with Cardinal Turkson and the Pontifical Council of Justice and Peace. We had an impact investing conference with them 2 years ago, and we're just about to run that again. And this, we're going from learning to doing. So we're really trying to engage the church into this new business and seeing if they can also leverage much greater capital into this new environment. So just in closing, I'm sure that many of you from the different NGOs are at different stages in this process, but over the last couple of years, these are some of the things that we've done then. We have set up our own, or we're developing our impact investment strategy and bringing that into play with the project designs that we have. We've set up our own team that really starts to look at what are the types of opportunities where we can bring in more private capital. We've joined the INGO network so that we're starting to talk with lots of like-minded people. And really if you go back to the first talk that Paul gave of that enormous growth in different types of funding compared to the flat line in development money, you can see why are we looking at that? Because that's where the growth in funding or the growth in investment opportunity is really going to be growing in the future. We as an agency have ring-fenced some of our reserves, and we're putting that into the impact investing funds area, and that's really for us to learn about what are those things and to understand, as Mary said, what are the metrics that really make a difference between a normal investment and investing in a social enterprise or an impact investment fund. And now what we're doing is we're looking right across all of our project portfolio, and I guess we run about 800 or 900 projects a year, and we're looking across all of those to see what is the pipeline of projects that we have where we can see the opportunity to blend finance, to extend things, to accelerate things, and also to provide this sustainability approach. We've made our first impact investing last year. Very simple, we're just putting a loan guarantee in, but that allows a company now to buy a lot more of the products from our farmers and to be able to sell them into a high-value market. And we will be looking more at sort of things like trade finance initially, but then starting to get into infrastructure investments in the future. And the other thing that we're trying to do also is to align that thinking also with the global church, and so that we can also start to work with that much larger network of people to accelerate, if you like, the ability to expand social services in a very different footing. And if you want more information, you can go to the CRS Investing for the Poor, and that provides you with a lot of great sort of videos and information about what the groups that we're working are doing to improve that case. So with that introduction, hand it back to the audience. Thanks very much.
They say because we did the dance in the beginning that we're kind of a little short of time. But you've heard now about how impact investing is really about taking, it could be starting in the nonprofit stage. We need mics, I guess.
Good morning, William Martin from CRS. I really like the speech about disruptive innovation. And I want also to point out that exists for emergencies intervention. For example, the African Union is right now developing an initiative with the African Risk Capacity. It's an insurance-linked securities product. And it's changing like a parametric insurance weather derivative, and it's changing the humanitarian landscape in terms of funding. And it heavily relies on ICT, satellite image, and all these things. So my follow-up question on that, and it's not only for emergency, but in the sector, one of the speakers mentioned disruptive innovation and some examples. So if you can maybe illustrate, what's coming up for the future, what will be these innovations?
Actually, there are so many, I don't know where to begin, but you can begin from the disruptions caused by 3D printing, which doesn't require lots of investments to change the African landscape. We have so many kids who have either limbs amputated because of bombs in several countries. We could be printing such, which are enterprises, are serious enterprises at the beginning, and the people begin to understand these technologies and they begin to do much more things. Africa has what I call the digital dividend, which we are not taking advantage. China is losing 85 million jobs because they don't have the population to undertake that. But in Africa, we are not making the right investments to actually take advantage of those and create more sustainable jobs. I think we are waiting India to finish, and then after India finishes, it comes to Africa. By then, we will not be having children. So we actually need to look forward and look at the disruptions. There are several big data analytics which give us a lot of information on productivity in farming. And Africa has a lot of problems with productivity, the farmers. And I tend to believe that God did not deny the Arabs land like ours. He meant that we do the farming, we take the food there, but we are leaving Brazil to bring all the food all the way to here. We actually need to open up the eyes of the people and say, you stay here, this is the kind of crop you need to grow, this is the market, this is what ought to be done. And there are several apps now that help farmers to be able to identify this. There are actually several, if you give me your email, I will send you several of the new disruptions that we are seeing coming out of here.
Thank you. There is one thing, there is the Global Impact Investing Network. If you go back in time, VCs didn't have a network for a very, very long time. They didn't talk to each other as much. But the Global Impact Investing Network actually looks at in what stages, as Mary said, we're still in the early stages, but the information is that at least in that early stage sustainability building, so maybe get to break even, not the scaling, that the impact investees are doing quite well. I think the big question is, which is where we won't know whether impact investing is really going to be fully successful, is can impact sourcing scale to have 5 million youth doing digital big data analytics and digital jobs? We don't know that yet. We know that the model works, and we know that the impact investor is getting their investees to get to break even. And I think that's the big question of whether is this going to be a true boon or is this going to be a, just okay. So, yeah. The last question, I think, is
I think one of the big consulting firms that I can tell you after the talk, when I'm not nervous and talking in front of people, wrote a really great report in taking innovation to scale. And there was like 4 key components that these great innovating companies that are happening here in Africa are really challenged with, is that when they go to scale, they can't continue to succeed. And a lot of it was taking it to similar places that were like where they're already operating and branching into consumers that from other areas that were reaching into them. I see a role for everybody on the table in that aspect. We need to de-risk it for those people that are already successful. Maybe they're not already needing that investment anymore. So maybe they are, maybe they're not. But if we can't get them to scale, people aren't going to continue to invest.
attract all the venture capital investors into impact investing, so then it becomes a way of life. I think I'm being given the poof. So thank you so much to the panel, and they're all available for discussions. I really appreciate the great perspectives.
Martha Newsom has actually been very kind to step in as the moderator, and I'm going to step back down as a panelist. We've had a number of visa issues and travel complications that have prevented our esteemed government guests from joining us this morning. But we're going to do our best to represent their views and their positions in the course of our conversations. So with apologies for that extended bio that you had to endure, let me invite Martha to do a quick introduction and take over. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so we didn't have dancing, but we wanted to keep you on your toes by switching around the moderators, so sorry about that. And I'm just so happy to see a pretty full room, so that shows the level of commitment and hopefully interest. I know all of us are here, I think, because we're interested in the issue of scale and how do we get to scale. So as Alan just said, I am not Dr. Alan Lebrique, but I think it's quite interesting that we took a Hopkins professor and replaced it with a Hopkins grad. So my background is public health, and I have a degree from Hopkins. I won't give you a long bio, but just to say that I lead World Vision's Sustainable Health Division, which is our global programs in food, health, water, sanitation, and hygiene. I've lived in Southern Africa for 15 years, and I'm a real champion of mobile health and digital technology, and have been working with inside of World Vision to push that forward. Also served on the mHealth Alliance board for a while. I'm on the steering committee of the Empower Frontline Health Workers Coalition. So that's just a little bit about me, but I really want to get to our panel. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try and speed read through their bios really quickly so that we can get to unpacking this journey to scale and what types of partnerships are required to get to scale and to be able to leverage our collective assets and strengths across the government, private sector, and civil society. So Dr. Garrett Mell, who's right to the left there of Alan, is a scientist at the World Health Organization. He focuses on digital innovations and research. He's the co-lead of the Digital Health and Interoperability Working Group of the Health Data Collaborative. And I hope you all know you can get to their bios on the app to get a more detailed bio for each of them. I'm going to skip Alan's bio because we had a nice full introduction there. And then we have Dr. Nkem Moma, who is a trained medical doctor now working in ICT. He's to my right here. He presently serves as the head of eHealth at the National Information Technology Development Agency in Nigeria. And so that's the agency within the government of Nigeria that's charged with the responsibility of regulating and promoting the deployment of ICT. So Nigeria only recently ratified its national health ICT framework, and they used the WHO ITU toolkit to do that, and his agency played a very significant role in doing that. Magnus Conte is a colleague of mine. He's the Director of Global Health Programs, Strategic Partnership, and Innovation for World Vision Ireland. He's also leading World Vision's involvement in a Janssen Johnson & Johnson Ebola vaccine trial that's underway in Sierra Leone, and he serves on our World Vision International Digital Health Steering Committee. So that's a little bit about each of them. I think I'm going to go and join them and sit down so that we can have a very friendly conversation about what it takes to get to scale and hear from each of the panelists. And I hope all of you are thinking about your own questions, and hopefully we'll have some time for dialogue. So good. So getting us started, let's think about first, what are the essential enabling components that are needed to scale ICT solutions where government leadership is really critical? So I don't know if Dr. Momo wants to get us started with that question. We'll see if other panelists want to jump in as well.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I was only drafted here recently, so permit my shortcomings if I have any. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me on this program, first of all. I work for not too well-known, but very, very, very important agency in Nigeria called NIDA, as she rightly said. And I think the issue of skill-ups is very, very integral to what we do, because NIDA is the agency in Nigeria that governs ICT essentially. And with regards to this issue she mentioned, I think interoperability and the issue of standards is very key and central to it. And since we govern that aspect of Nigeria's health ICT, I think I'm in the right place, I believe. For us in Nigeria, the political will was very, very key. Being a developing country, the political will is very important. You have to engender political will, first of all, to have all the other stakeholders come in. Without that, you can't move forward. So we did a lot of work in engendering political will, first of all. After that, we went about getting the stakeholders to engage. Stakeholders included the Federal Ministry of Health, Federal Ministry of Communication Technology, the State Ministry of Health, the relevant agencies like my agency, NIDA, and others, the Health Insurance Agency. Then, of course, you have the NGOs and the donor agencies who, for Nigeria, the Norwegian government gave us some funding to start off the process. This took a period of 18 months to develop the framework which we now have, which will guide the process of e-health implementation in Nigeria. So I think a needed first step there is the political will, stakeholder engagement. Then you can take it to the micro elements like incentives for the investors in the sector, favorable policies to guide them, and then of course the issue of interoperability, which NIDA already handles standards, setting standards there for interoperability and what have you. The other issues I want to say is that government sets this tone, and then the rest follow in Nigeria. And then for issues concerning cost disparities, where ICT is important is because, I'll give you an example. The ICT contribution to our GDP in 2014 was about 7%. But in 2015, it was 14%. So the exponential increase in GDP, in ICT contribution to our GDP, is increasing every year. So with that ICT involvement, you can't help but understand that health would necessarily be a beneficiary as well. The issue of cost disparities can be brought to the fore with health ICT. There are people who are living in distant locations where they can't get laboratory tests done. With integrated laboratory information systems, we can get them to get access to labs that are in remote locations and have their test results brought to their own local communities. These are the ways we think ICT can help in the Nigerian e-health space. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Dr. Momo. And I think just the government is so key in terms of providing that overall leadership. Yes. So thank you for unpacking that. I don't know if anyone else want to comment on that question, or we can move to the next one. Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, I think our colleague from Nigeria pointed out a lot of important points about the role of government and the vision that they have for standards, as well as a roadmap in which sort of they have a collective vision with the different stakeholders in country, as well as a flourishing private sector around the use of ICT that may exist in country already. Being able to establish what a vision and a plan looks like for the government will enable the ecosystem to help build to those needs. and being able to establish those priorities and delineate what is a priority for the government versus what is not helps to, I think, make sure that there are wise investments taking place. So putting that roadmap out in front and ensuring that that roadmap reflects both the Build 2 standards, but also an evidence base of what works and what doesn't work. So I would say there's value in having some guidance or guidelines that would facilitate knowing what is a smart investment and what is not, as well as the processes that our colleague mentioned where there are different stakeholders that can help the ministry realize its vision, and ensuring that that discussion is taking place in a format that's driven by government, I think is really, really helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Garrett. Let's move on and think a bit about the private sector. Unfortunately, the private sector member of the panel got ill, and so I think we'll each of us try and put our private sector hats on, and we can certainly hear from the private sector that's in the room later. But what is the role in terms of these collaborative partnerships that are trying to bring ICT for scale, especially within health system strengthening to achieve our SDG goal for health, ending preventable deaths? I don't know who would like to take a stab at that question. Alan, are you going to be our Bangladesh private sector person?
I'll emulate a private sector hat because we work very closely in many of our implementations with private sector partners. When we look at the capacity of government in many of the countries in which we work, the dynamic and fast-moving nature of the ICT space is such that the human resources required to stay on top of this evolving landscape is something that's quite challenging for most governments that we work with. Having a strong relationship with private sector that can be trusted as a partner is something that's absolutely critical to get these large projects off the ground. When I think back to what happened in early January of 2012 in Uganda, where there was a moratorium imposed by the government due to this fear of uncoordinated proliferation of projects by both the private sector as well as the public sector NGO space, it was largely because of this lack of central vision and coordination. And I think having the Build 2 standards, as Dr. Mel just pointed out, available from government or private sector to be contributing to the initiatives that government has laid out as a priorities are absolutely critical. But I also think that there is an absence of these enabling policies that take into account the challenges that private sector companies face. Not having those two standards, not having clear delineation of what are the data security, data ownership, data privacy laws in particular countries, constricts their ability to really build systems that will be sustainable and scalable. So I think the other key word that we hear these days, not just in ICT for health, but ICT for development broadly, is interoperability. And thinking about the business case for private sector players to build interoperable systems as opposed to locked down owned systems that belong to that particular company. The business case in contributing to a system or to an ecosystem of products which work together is one that we have to really define very carefully, because we're coming out of a space where proprietary software, proprietary systems have been largely the norm. I think that's going to be the challenge for those of us on the normative side as well as on the private sector side.
For somebody like myself who comes from the not-for-profit sector, it's kind of strange that I would want to comment on the role of the private sector. But of course, as most of you here are aware, we depend on the ability and the skills and the knowledge base of the private sector to develop innovative solutions that help to resolve our challenges in the field in terms of implementing our programs. That is, of course, if we are able to convince them to pay attention to addressing our needs or the needs of our programs, as opposed to developing solutions because it's exciting for them to come up with new solutions. I think for me that's a good starting point. My colleague has just mentioned the issue also of creating open source solutions as opposed to solutions that are closed, that cannot be shared, that are not interoperable. For us, the cost of running those type of solutions is quite expensive and difficult within the not-for-profit organizations. I think we also need to be aware that businesses have shareholders that they have to pay dividends to. And therefore, whilst we are bringing them into our space to support our work, we also need to acknowledge the kind of profit margin that that will allow them to continue to invest and continue to innovate. Whilst we negotiate with them for lower costs, for the situations where they can use some of their corporate social responsibility budgets and funding to support our programs, whilst at the same time helping them to create business models that will make our programs sustainable. Because at the end of investment at the end of donor funding, if the governments are not able to support these programs are going to collapse. So in our public-private partnership and our involvement as NGOs with the private sector, we need to think about these various discussions and dynamic and making sure that we are developing a business case that allows our bottom of the pyramid to benefit from these solutions, whilst at the same time governments are making some investment, but the private sector is also able to make the investment that will continue to innovate in terms of the various solutions.
I think the world's economy is evolving, and that of the developing world too is evolving as well. We're moving from the place of purely state-owned industries, private sector and governments are merging together now. And in Nigeria, that's also the case as well. We can't keep running things as a public sector. Private sector has to get involved ultimately to plug the gap. And having said that, we should also take note of the fact that with the public sector, there's a lot of red tape syndrome there, a lot of bureaucracy. So all this will be mitigated with private sector involvement. That's why it's imperative that they get involved.
Let's talk about evidence for a minute too, in terms of do we have a sufficient amount of evidence around the value of digital innovation? Is that been an obstacle in any way to scale up?
So I wouldn't see it as an obstacle as much as a catalyst. Evidence can help to ensure that a product where there's documented value over alternatives can be presented to the different stakeholders who are going to be critical for it to scale. So evidence of value to government as opposed when they're looking at alternative investments. Evidence of value for the stakeholders who are involved in implementation as partners, etc. And I think being able to provide evidence from a health standpoint, from a health system strengthening standpoint, from the perspective of value in terms of other stakeholders like MNOs is critical. I think in the absence of it, it's a solution with hype without merit. And when we have a restriction on the amount of investments that a government or the field development can make, we need to make sure they're wise investments. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us working in the field to ensure that we're following good practice and ensuring that we're collecting evidence. I would add to that as a normative agency that advises governments on health, it's our responsibility to ensure that the investments that governments are making are informed by best practice and evidence of value. And so being able to have synthesized evidence in a format that we can recommend to governments is important. I'll just make note that we're starting to undergo a process of development of guidance in this area, and we've noticed that there is an absence of, there is evidence in this area, but it's a mixed bag, and we want to make sure that those of you who are working in the field are collecting and documenting evidence in a systematic way that's helpful for us to be able to synthesize that and bring that into our recommendations. About a month ago, guidelines on reporting on mHealth and digital health innovations in the literature, in the published literature, and it's called the MIRA guidelines. And for those of you who are doing research or doing impact or evaluation studies, I would advise you to have a look at that checklist, and that'll help us then bring your own solutions, and maybe not the product itself, but rather the strategy you're using into the guidelines so that we can ensure that governments are aware of the value of that strategy.
Yeah, Magnus, there's Exhibit A, so you can... Maybe also, I'm wondering if we've made the case adequately to ministers of finance. So Magnus, I know you wanted to say something, but maybe we'll check in with our Dr. Moman, the Nigerian case, if the ministers of finance are actually convinced, if we've presented that evidence in a compelling way to show that those investments are really worth it. So this is the last question. I've been getting the nod from the facilitators here, but so all of you on the panel, you can make one statement. So if you had a magic wand and you could do one thing to make scale up happen globally, what would it be? Or what would be one constraint that you would banish from your kingdom? Garrett.
So mine will sound like a normative agency. But so we have the essential health interventions that are recommended to every country, and those include vaccination, contraceptives, etc. And I think the risk adversity that ministries and governments have, and I think investors more broadly have, is due to the fact that we don't have an essential digital package that stipulates functional requirements and non-functional requirements that should be part of any package to complement the health system. I think having that in place would ensure investments take place and that governments are confident in the investments that they make.
Great. So we've got the unbreakable and never-ending phone, and then the digital package that can complement the health system. Magnus, what would your wand do?
I think we all are very cognizant of the level of competition that exists between NGOs, solution providers, the private sector, and even within amongst donors. So for me, what I would like to see is a departure from what sometimes we talk about as competitive advantage, which is good in business because it makes you more attractive to a donor or more attractive to the marketplace, to moving towards what I will refer to as collaborative advantage. Because by collaborating, you create synergies that are much more beneficial to the populations that we serve. And therefore, I would like to put out a dare out there. I dare all NGOs to put away your competitive advantage and work more collaboratively. And I will say the same thing to private sector, to solution providers, to put your business skills and knowledge together collaboratively and provide us with better solutions, the kind of solutions that have just been described here, the unbreakable solutions. And finally, to our donors also, I would like to say, let's move away from this RPFs that, or whatever they call that you put out and you have your specific requirements and specific programs and specific solutions you want to promote, to moving towards aligning behind governments and supporting their strategies in making sure that they deliver on scale-up programs. Because it's only when we put our resources together that we can truly support ministries with these programs to go to scale. Otherwise, what we're going to end up doing is supporting 2 districts, 1 county, or maybe supporting a program for a couple of years before the funding comes to an end. That is not sustainable. We now need to move to collaborative advantage.
Great. So we're banishing competition. That's radical. So Dr. Bowman, what would you do?
If I had a magic wand, I think I would encourage everyone in this hall to embrace the nuances around universal health coverage, UHC. That would be one thing I would want to have done. We all know what UHC portends for the developing world in particular. If we all can embrace it, it will take us to the next level much quicker. In that regard, I would like to also announce that my agency, Nigeria, is trying to take the lead in this regard. We have a conference in October with the theme, Digitizing Healthcare in Africa to achieve universal health coverage. It's a very, very poignant topic, and I want as many of us here to come for the event. If you see me after this, if I can give you the link to the event, you can register and attend. It's in October this year. UHC, I think, is the key to the next level, universal health coverage. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Quite an impressive list there. So we're going to have that unbreakable device that never needs to be charged. We're going to have a full digital package that goes with our health systems strengthening work that we do. We're going to banish competition, and we're going to achieve universal health care. That's a pretty good list. I think maybe the only thing that I might add to that is perhaps more for the donors in the room is, can we banish projects? Because these projects are short-term, they're not national at scale, and they lead to sort of all the ills that we've talked about in the panel. So if I could add my banishing of projects and let's fund long-term, sustained efforts and the roadmap, Garrett, that you talked about, then I think we can get to scale. So look forward to talking to all of you over the break. I'm sorry that we didn't have time for questions. I'm just checking with the facilitators to see, nope, he's saying, okay, so we'll have the questions over coffee and tea now. Oh, one announcement, quickly.
I would just like to plug a session this afternoon, which is on the multi-stakeholder collaborative that we are working towards setting up in Sierra Leone. So if anybody is interested in learning about the processes and the journey that we have embarked on so far, please come to our session this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
So